All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty wild. We're not just talking about a topic, we're breaking down the actual scientific method someone built to investigate a seriously radical idea, a possible link between a holy book and, get this, our own DNA. So, is there a genetic map hidden in a holy book? I mean, let's just jump right in. The claim is, well, it's huge. It's that a hidden code in the Quran lines up perfectly with the human X chromosome. Now, look, that is a bold claim. But for today, we're not going to debate whether it's true or not. Instead, we're going to focus on something maybe even more interesting. How in the world do you even begin to scientifically test an idea like that? Okay, so here's the core hypothesis, laid out plain and simple. We're not talking about some vague, mystical feeling. Nope, this is a super specific two-part idea. Part 1, the physical location of a verse in the Quran is supposed to match the physical location of a gene on the X chromosome. Part 2 is even crazier. The meaning of that verse is supposed to describe what that specific gene actually does. All right, so where do you even begin with that? I mean, seriously, how do you compare a holy book to a strand of DNA? They're from completely different worlds. Well, the very first problem you have to solve is creating some kind of common map, right? You need a shared ruler to measure them both. And wow, this slide really just lays it all out, doesn't it? On one side, you've got a holy book with chapters and verses in ancient Arabic, read right to left. On the other, the human genome, genes and exons, written in genetic code, read left to right. They're total opposites. So before you can do anything else, you have to find a way to make them speak the same, let's call it, mathematical language. So here's how they did it. It was basically a three-step process. First, they took the Quran and standardized it into a fixed 600-page layout. Think of it like making a standard edition. Second, they took the massive X chromosome map and just squished it down to a simple percentage scale, from 0 to 100. And third, and this is super clever, they flipped the chromosome map so it also reads from right to left, just like the Quran. And just like that, boom, you can actually lay them next to each other and compare them directly. Okay, that's really clever for lining up the locations. That's one half of the puzzle solved. But what about the other half, the meaning? How on earth do you take metaphorical, poetic language from a sacred text and turn it into something you can test, into actual hard data? Well, the method they came up with is called semantic interpretation. And it sounds complicated, but just think about what it means. You have to somehow translate this beautiful, often poetic, ancient Arabic into a super specific clinical term. We're talking something like a clear medical symptom or a biological function that a doctor would recognize. Now, obviously, you can see the biggest problem here, right? Bias. How do you stop people from just seeing what they want to see? To try and solve that, they built in some really important safeguards. They got a whole panel of independent experts, people who knew both the science and the religious text. They gave everyone the exact same rulebook to follow for interpretation, and crucially, they decided to only focus on verses that could be translated into something really, really specific and clear, leaving the more vague stuff aside. So once they had a potential symptom from a verse, it was like the starting gun for a huge data hunt. The researchers then went and systematically searched all the major genetic databases. We're talking NCI, OMMM, the big ones, looking for any gene that's already known to be linked to that exact symptom. And they wrote down everything, every search, every result, so the whole process was totally transparent and anyone else could come along and do the exact same thing. Okay, so this all leads to the big moment, the final test. At this point, you've got a list of potential matches, right? A verse at a certain location seems to talk about a function of a gene at that same location. But, and this is the million-dollar question, how do you know if you found something real, a genuine pattern? Or are you just, seeing faces in the clouds, just connecting random dots? Well, the answer is math, specifically statistics. The researchers used what's called a statistical association test. It's basically a mathematical way of asking, is the pattern we're seeing so strong that it's unlikely to have happened by random luck? Or is it just the kind of thing you'd expect to see if you were just throwing darts at a board? And really, that is the one question this whole complex method was built to answer. Is there a real, non-random connection here? Or are we just fooling ourselves connecting dots that aren't actually there? The whole point of the math is for it to be the cold, hard, impartial judge. But a huge part of doing good science, especially with something this out there, is being really honest about the problems and the challenges. It's not about pretending you have all the answers. It's about acknowledging your limitations. And they were totally upfront about the hurdles they faced. For one, our map of the human genome is literally changing all the time as we learn more. For another, gene locations aren't always neat little points on a map. They can be fuzzy, they can overlap. And then there's this other really interesting idea they had to consider. What if their verses don't match up to whole genes, but to smaller pieces inside the genes, called exons? Their whole method had to be built to deal with all that messiness and uncertainty. And that's exactly why they put such a huge emphasis on transparency. It was like their #1 rule. Every single step, from how they created the map to how they ran the stats, was all laid out in the open. The idea was that any other scientist from any other lab could pick up their recipe and try to bake the same cake just to see if they get the same result. So really, the main takeaway here isn't about getting a final yes or no answer to the big question. That wasn't really the point. The point was to see if they could build a solid, repeatable, scientifically valid process, a framework for asking a question that most people would say is unaskable. And that kind of leaves us with a big final thought, about what science is really all about. When you're asking these huge, radical questions at the edge of what we know, what's more important, the specific answer you find, or the integrity and the rigor of the tools you build just to be able to ask the question in the first place?